Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Firefighters Podcast, where we seek to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operator through a series of wide-ranging conversations. Now, before we go any further, just hit that rate, follow, or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to. It's a key performance indicator for us and helps us reach even more people. Now, here's what we've got for you today. My guest on the podcast today is Emily Watkins. She is a researcher and technical instructor at the University of Brighton. The focus of some of her research and the focus on our conversation today is on the impact of frequent heat exposure on fire service instructors, BAIs and CFBTs. This has opened a critical dialogue on the health and well-being of firefighters generally, and particularly in light of our increased risk due to chronic occupational exposure. Now, as we all know, firefighting is an inherently dangerous profession, and the environmental conditions faced during operations can exacerbate these dangers. Chronic exposure to extreme heat can lead and does lead to a host of adverse effects which we're all suffering from. These include dehydration, heat exhaustion, and even heat stroke. However, the implications go even deeper. Frequent high temperature conditions can trigger persistent inflammatory responses in the body. This negatively affects the immune system, and Emily's research highlights how BAIs specifically, who regularly endure these stressful environments, may experience chronic inflammation, which can and does increase susceptibility to various health issues, including cardiovascular disease. The physiological toll of firefighting doesn't stop there. Firefighters can often encounter psychological challenges as well. The intense workloads associated with firefighting, coupled with the frequent heat exposure, can lead to fatigue, mood disturbances, and mental health issues, which I'm sure we're all too familiar with. Watkins' study emphasises the need for comprehensive testing and screening for firefighters, which we've seen in the UK in places. This focuses on both physical and psychological health indicators. By understanding these impacts, the firefighting community, all of us, can better address the needs of our personnel and develop effective preventative measures. It's a significant concern that I know a lot of instructors have, and this was raised during the conversation that we had today, and funding and support for research in this area is needed. Despite the alarming evidence, there is often a reluctance to confront the long-term implications of occupational exposure from services and the national framework, especially when it comes to securing resources for research. The World Health Organization has declared firefighting a carcinogenic occupation, underscoring the urgent need for evidence-based strategies to mitigate health risks, including our exposure to heat. Emily's research also sheds a light on the unique challenges faced by female firefighters, whose physiological differences may necessitate tailored research and support addressing the health and well-being of all firefighters. Regardless of gender, it is crucial as we all serve on the front line, protecting communities while often neglecting our own health. Ultimately, our conversation highlights the importance of integrating academic research into the first responder community more and more. So by leveraging these scientific findings, our firefighting profession can work towards establishing protocols that prioritize the health of its members, emphasizing the necessity of self-care and early support. As our dialogue continues through the episode, we hope it is going to pave the way for a healthier future for all of our firefighter community, ensuring we receive the recognition and support that we all deserve. I know you're going to take a lot away from today's episode. It's a pleasure to introduce Emily Watkins. I'll see you on the other side. I always get really excited about having people like you on the podcast because, as we sort of spoke about before we started today, in our world of first responders, and you do find this in a lot of organisations, it's a bit like business. I always say you're too busy working in the thing that you don't get a chance to work on the thing. And then sometimes when we try to do that, we sometimes don't have that kind of academic rigour to be able to prove the things we want to prove or say the things we want to say in a way that will perhaps help pull the right levers to convince overlords, if you will, it sounds a bit weird, to convince them of some of the stuff that's going on. So part of your studies as a researcher and technical instructor, I came across some of the research that you'd done quite some time ago in the Journal of Thermal Biology, and it had the lovely ring to, these things get so long with their titles, don't they? We said it before we came on. Inflammatory and psychological consequences of chronic high exposure firefighting. So before we kind of kick off and jump into that rabbit hole head first, could you give us a bit of an understanding around your kind of background as a researcher, the work you're involved in, and why you kind of chose this as an area of study?
Yeah, so I'm currently working at the University of Roehampton. I'm a senior lecturer there. So that means some of my time is teaching based and some of my time is research based. I've been working with fire and rescue services now for probably the last 10 or so years. I'm looking at various different aspects to do with health and well-being. And for me, it's really the case of it's nice to be working with people who really care about the answers. And a lot of our research doesn't come from me sitting in an office deciding I'm interested in this, but it actually comes from firefighters saying this is something they're interested in, this is something they're concerned about, and something that they think might be important. And it's really nice to be that kind of bridge, as you say a little bit there, to kind of think about, well, how can we help? How can we provide the academic rigor kind of side of things and develop these studies to be able to provide some data to answer some of the questions, really?
Some of this stuff is, as you sort of alluded to there, we are a very passionate bunch of beautiful freaks in the first responder community. We tend not to really be able to work very well in normal 9-to-5 jobs, and we get attracted, police officers, paramedics, firefighters, all this sort of stuff, to areas where we can learn a bit more kinesthetically, and we can do work that like involves us to problem solve, sometimes on a big scale, but just like I always say, we're like knuckle dragging firefighters, as I said before. Some people probably take offense at that term, but it really helps when someone brings these insights and the ability to turn what is now a very emotive subject. So some of this alludes to when we're talking about health management and we're talking about chronic high exposure firefighting. It's a very emotive subject for some people in the services for several reasons. One is the big C word, and I don't mean the offensive one, I obviously mean cancer. And it's not an overly funny topic because we're now seeing the long-term consequences of a lot of this. You mentioned earlier that you had some sort of insights and that you advised on some of the World Health Organization, the panel that they had, I think you said in 2022. So with it being such an emotive subject, why do you think we're so reluctant to, because this stuff has to get funded as well. I know you guys and girls have to study something as part of your professions, but how does this stuff get funded? Because I often feel quite disappointed that it doesn't. We're not necessarily the ones doing it half the time. Does it come from the government? Does it come from universities themselves? How is this gone about, if you will? This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Gore-Tex Professional Fabrics. Now, we all know the working environment of a firefighter is filled with challenges. We face serious risks on the job, such as heat exhaustion, burns, physical and mental stress, and we frequently come into contact with high levels of toxic chemicals. Now, I have been wearing Gore-Tex for nearly 2 decades on the front line, working in hostile environments, tackling challenging incidents from firefighting to water incidents and in urban search and rescue environments. Gore-Tex have a well-earned reputation for protecting professionals in the fire and emergency services through their family of highly innovative, waterproof, breathable moisture barriers that exceeds global performance standards and are trusted worldwide. Gore-Tex, going further together.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. It's a little bit tricky, if I'm honest. I would love to do more studies and larger studies than we've previously done, but funding is often a stumbling block. And funding isn't necessarily just the time in terms of my time or other researchers' time on the project, but also in terms of the cost of actually the consumables and running some of the analysis that physically can't be done without money to fund them. Funding can come from a whole different...
all the time that you have to spend trying to get access to these people as well. And
Yep.
You have to try and make it authentic and valid as well. You can't go, well, I met a firefighter at my local gym, so I just asked him, basically. You know, you have to have a quantifiable sample size and all this jazz, don't you? And there has to have a level of authenticity to it. You can't ask someone that's only had a year in the job and, you know, you've done a lot of your stuff with instructors and people that have done a lot of time in it, but I imagine that's a huge barrier for people to get the inroads to do that sort of stuff as well.
Yeah, I think it completely depends on what the study is. So it depends on if you're looking at new recruits particularly, and then it's a case of, well, how do you get access to services and talk to people and kind of network to try and get access to individuals who want to be involved.
Yeah, sorry, my dogs are just exploding as you may hear. Did they come across? I don't know if they came across. Yeah, they absolutely lost their minds. So, help people who are unfamiliar. The World Health Organization made a declaration back in, was it 2021, that firefighting was now classed as a carcinogenic profession. Was it 2021?
Just looking at your...
Let's have a look.
So it's 2022.
2022
is when the workshop met, and then I think the full monograph publication came out in 2023.
Okay, so how does that actually change things from your perspective within the sector? Because we would like to assume that a declaration such as that should provoke another series of studies and support and a much greater appetite to be able to provide people working in these organisations with some strongly evidence-backed reasons to put in place some more preventative measures, and at least also you'd hope some long-term tracking of this sort of stuff.
Yeah, so in 2007, the IARC monograph series had previously evaluated firefighting and cancer.
What's a monograph series, sorry?
So a monograph series is essentially what the International Agency for Research on Cancer work towards. So they have a range of experts that they get together that essentially review all of the data, and they write it all up in what we call a monograph. So think of it like a really big, long book. So a little bit longer than what your normal research paper might be. And it evaluates all of this data and evidence against set criteria to decide essentially and evaluate whether the thing causes cancer or not. And so back in 2007, they did this process, but they didn't have enough evidence as to say that it was definitely carcinogenic for humans. They said it was possible. And since then, there's been a whole...
That's a really difficult thing, because I always say there's no solutions, only trade-offs. Like the plastic bottle that I'm drinking from is leaching plastic into the water and probably giving me cancer as well. And probably my dog is probably also giving me cancer in some capacity. And we all put so many things into our body. And also, I suppose in the UK, we have much more of a aversion to this finger-pointing political minefield, where we don't want everyone that's been a firefighter for the last 30 years to turn around and start suing the government. And I know that sounds very tinfoil hat pessimist, but there is an element to that as well. These are big things to plant your flag on either side of, the blame, isn't it, I suppose?
Yeah, so there's a whole host of different things that can be related to cancer, and that's not something to be ignored. And I think it is very hard to say that this is one thing that does or doesn't cause cancer. But essentially, the aim of these monograph series is to look not just at the studies that exist, but also the quality of those studies. So have they controlled for lots of other things that might be linked to cancer, for instance? Have they controlled the comparisons that they're making? So it doesn't just evaluate the study's findings, but the quality of them too. So the recent evaluation essentially pulls together international data and the more recent papers that have come out since the previous evaluation, and makes this concluding statement that it's classed as what we call group 1. So there's sufficient evidence to say that it's carcinogenic. Now, that doesn't look at risk. It just looks at the case that this type of exposure can cause cancer. So it's not about the frequency, for instance, or other factors within that. It's just the association that exists. And I guess thinking about what that means from a UK perspective is that there's quite a lot of data globally, and this enables us to pull it all together. And hopefully what it can then enable, particularly from a UK perspective, to do is to start thinking about what does this mean for our firefighters, and most importantly, what can we do to help protect our firefighters now that it's a little bit less kind of ambiguous and unknown, and there's a little bit more kind of solid evaluation of that evidence.
I always think like it's one of those things, if we'd have known better, we'd have done better in the past. That's probably the case with so many things in everyone's life. But now there seems to be an undeniable, through the work of people such as yourself, Anna Steck and others, who have put a lot of academic rigour behind this, and it's close, very, 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 very closely getting to the point where there seems to be quite an undeniable wave of evidence, all pointing in a very uncomfortably similar direction. And I wonder when we get to that point where we can unequivocally say that. And I don't inherently want to, because in doing so, I'd be in that bucket of doing it for nearly 20 years now and probably not doing a lot of things in the way I should have been doing it. And that does fill me with a sense of dread, the things that I've exposed my children to, picking them up after work and having the fire kit in the car and all of these things, washing my clothes with my children's clothes. And it's not a very nice reality to confront. And I try to keep a sunny disposition to our conversation, but so I want to go a little bit further into the paper as a first and foremost, but I do want to pull back. I want us to circle back to the WHO at some point, just to try and get an understanding for some of the other people that you may have interacted with from other nations, just to see if there's correlations there, if because I know Canada and America seem to be much further ahead with us in some of this stuff, and that will be attributed sometimes to their size and resources. Their emergency, their first responders is a much bigger sector. But to look at the introduction for yours, and we'll make this link to this article. And please, I will stumble my way through this, so please feel free to interrupt and correct. But just to give people a framework. So in the introduction, it says, the acute health consequences of firefighting have been much interrogated over recent decades, with strong evidence to indicate an association between firefighters and cardiovascular events, post-traumatic stress disorder and musculoskeletal injuries. However, the long-term implications of the occupational role and the extent of immune changes after operational exposure are less well documented. In recent years, BAIs, breathing apparatus instructors, have been highlighted as a unique population amongst the firefighting profession, with BAI completing a significantly greater monthly exposure compared to firefighters. Understanding the consequences of exposure frequencies is important to ensure BAI can work effectively in their roles, as individuals who are fit and healthy are less likely to take time off sick and are more likely to work safely and effectively. So when you were looking at this sample size, when did you become aware, and through which sort of conversations? Because I also... and I don't know if there was any correlation to it. I probably should have asked you before we came on. But I sent you a document that was published by our Chief Fire Officers Association around health management of compartment fire behaviour instructors. So these are CFBTs,
Yep.
which is basically the same thing. So breathing apparatus instructors, and I apologise if you probably know all of this already, but we have listeners at very early stages of their career and all the way through. So I try not to lose anyone as we have our conversations. So for people that are unfamiliar, a breathing apparatus instructor won't inherently always mean that they're going to come into contact with more carcinogens, because across the UK we have synthetic smokes, we have gas rigs. These aren't all live fire carbonaceous burns. But our compartment fire behaviour instructors, which is perhaps why the Chief Fire Officers Association have focused in more on this, typically take students through a learning journey of compartment firefighting with carbonaceous environments, looking at how the fire and the heat and the ventilation profile behave in those environments. I've been doing it for quite a number of years as a BI and a CFBT and all this sort of stuff. How did you first learn of this and choosing it? I mean, I know it sounds obvious to focus in on BAIs, but I'm more interested in when you speak about exposure frequency and using that as a sample group. And if you could talk us through like how big of a group you interacted with, just to help people understand the sort of breadth and depth that we went into with this. This episode is brought to you in partnership with MSA Safety. Today we have them to thank for the improved firefighter safety through connectivity in their brand new connected firefighter system. At the center of the connected firefighter platform is the MSA M1 SCBA with telemetry. That integrates straight in with the Luna system, which is a wireless all-in-one device creating an independent search and rescue network, providing edge detection, enhanced personal thermal imaging, while simplifying post-scene reporting and data retention. All of this then plugs into the FireGrid system for cloud-based connectivity, real-time information, and data-driven decisions for the incident commander. MSA are truly taking massive strides in the future of improved firefighter safety through connectivity in the brand new MSA Connected Firefighter platform. Now back to the show.
Yeah, so I guess the why aspect of the group itself is really because we were getting kind of hearing about anecdotal evidence from instructors about them kind of getting high levels of fatigue, not feeling very well, frequent kind of symptoms of colds and flus, kind of mood changes. And that kind of really sparked the research area to look into, well, what was causing this? Was it...
That might be me today, you know, because I'm actually just done 2 days, literally as stupid as it sounds. So for people that... I don't feel fantastic this afternoon, and I've just done 2 days of fire behaviour in a different fire service and haven't done it in a couple of weeks. So I think my my sort of familiarisation, my body's acclimatisation might have dropped off a little bit, and I haven't been wearing in those environments in a little while. And I feel like I'm hanging out of my bottom today. And I didn't even make the connection. I just thought it was working out too much or whatever. Sorry, I interrupted you, but I wonder if that's why I'm feeling a bit rough today. Go on.
Yeah, it very much could be. How many exposures do you normally do a month, or are you kind of regular, or you've had some time away?
So I appreciate we're being recorded, but I think we're not supposed to have any more than 12. Okay. And I'm sure some people will go, what, really? What service is that guy in? Blah, blah, blah. We do more than that. We informally track it, and we have grades of how... I think I actually shared a document that was completely useless to you, and I forgot I included it, but about how we track our exposure levels. And it's like, if it's an arduous wear, if it was an arduous wear with heat and smoke, if and what type of smoke that was, and to what rough temperature were we involved in. So if it's just a gas rig, it's probably not getting much above 300-400 degrees, to be honest, because these are big steel containers and we crash vent them and all that sort of stuff. If it's a live fire burn, and we go through like a demo box where we show it through incipient fire growth flashover, and we're in there for the entirety of it, and we're not supposed to do more than like 10 or 12 of them a month, which equates to whatever it is, 3 a week. But you just do what the needs of the service are. It's one of those. It's kind of a nice to versus a need to. Because if I then go and do some CPD, as I have been doing the last 2 days at another service, and I did 5 or 6 wears in 2 days, so that's going to stop me working theoretically, but it won't. But then also I cast my mind forward 30 years and I go, maybe I should just say no.
Yeah, so you're not unusual with the numbers that you're talking about there. So we started doing work in this area with a survey to understand what instructors were currently feeling, what kind of symptoms they were having, if there was anything common going on. And from that survey, we found that kind of some instructors were following this kind of 139 rule that you kind of mentioned there a little bit. But around 45% of those we surveyed didn't have any limits that they were using. And even if they did, they weren't necessarily following those limits. And some instructors were having up to around 40 odd exposures a month. So you can see the range. We're not going to say what services they
were from, but were these in the UK?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, so a really big range of kind of the number of exposures. Yeah.
And what did you classify that? So were the classifications as in, was this a fire you were in for longer than 30 minutes above a certain temperature? How specific was the ask on that one?
Yeah, so these were just a fire exposure. So for an instructor, kind of a scenario where they were running a training fire exposure, there wasn't a time distinction or a type of exposure distinction.
Okay. So I apologise for interrupting you, but please carry on. So you had these markers, and they were going off for a bit of a 139 thing, but it wasn't really mandated in a lot of places. What were the common things that people were referring back? Because in the introduction it says about elevations in certain biomarkers, inflammatory markers, heart rate, core temperatures, reported across a range of different activities.
Yeah, so we know from kind of an acute one-off fire exposure, there's lots and lots of evidence about those. We know we get increases in heart rate, we get high core temperatures occurring, and we know that we also get increases in what we call markers of inflammation. So that's totally normal and what you would expect to happen from a fire exposure. Your body's working really hard, you're in a hot environment, you've got kit on that's preventing you from losing that heat, plus the heat you're producing yourself, plus the environment. That's all as you would expect it to be. But what we're really interested in is what happens on a more chronic basis. So if that's your one-off exposure, those levels should go back to normal. So your heart rate you'd expect would return to normal, your core temperature return to normal, and you'd expect to see those inflammation markers return to normal as well, which is what you tend to see after a one-off, say, going for a run and doing a bit of hard exercise, for instance.
I was going to say, because things like saunas have been proven to be incredible reduction in all-cause mortality, the benefits of heat shock protein release and all this sort of jazz, and I sauna a lot. So if we were to step ourselves outside of the sector for a second, and I said to you, Emily, I once or twice a week I expose myself to a high level of heat for around 30 minutes, and I feel like it's really good for me. Actually, I think it's really. How would we try and differentiate the two and say that these inflammatory biomarkers are bad? I know that's a very rubbish question, but like saunas and ice bath and all that jazz. I ice bath as well on a few times a week because I'm one of them morons that does all that. Although there is some useful evidence behind it, it's not just all for the Instagram rubbish. But like, help us differentiate why that would be a bad thing. Inflammation in the body is pretty horrific anyway, long term, but so many things cause inflammation, don't they?
Yeah, so I think it's the combination of, it's not just the heat, it's also the physical stress your body's experiencing in terms of the task you're doing and the ability that you don't have to lose the heat in that scenario, the weight that you might be carrying if you're doing certain exercises with hoses or you're dragging dummies, for instance, and also possibly the contamination exposure as well. So there's some evidence that, for instance, like wood smoke exposure away from any kind of physiological strain aspect can also lead to these increased markers markers of inflammation. So it's the combination of these things. And it's also considering, as I say, the return to normal that should happen. And in a lot of cases, we talk about exercise as being beneficial for kind of diseases that are inflammatory diseases, because they over time can help reduce inflammation. But here we're thinking more about the scenario of if you've got a quite high frequency of exposures with these multiple aspects of exposures together, and trying to see, well, what's happening there, and are these kind of inflammatory markers of concern, essentially.
In the studies, when we say about high markers of concern, there's some, because when I do link this in below, people are going to need a bit of help. The stuff you write, and a lot of people from your academic world, like I said before, I wonder sometimes who it's written for. I think sometimes it's written for each other, with the greatest of respect, because it can be very difficult to digest for someone with a significantly lower level of education, such as myself. So when I'm reading this, it references the American Heart Association Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, saying that these sorts of markers are a low risk for CPR. And again, please correct me if I'm getting a lot of this wrong. But high levels of risk for cardiovascular disease. What are cytokines?
Yeah.
Being established as a predictor of cardiovascular events?
So cytokines are like messengers in our body, essentially. So they're protein messengers, and they're particularly good at messaging and involved with our immune system. So think of them as little proteins traveling around our body, sending messages to our immune system. And what they're really important for is kind of causing our immune system to then respond. So kind of causing inflammation, swelling, redness, if you think about what it might look on your skin surface, but inside our body. So causing cells to adhere to a certain area to try and help with healing, for instance, and stimulating cells to communicate with other cells for those kind of processes to happen.
I remember having a chronic issue with my knee with that. So I snapped my patella tendon about 18 months ago. And I remember the physio telling me, we need to help the body move on to the next phase, he says, because you keep cycling back into inflammation and your body won't move into the next stage of healing. Probably a useless sidebar that may not add any contribution as an analogy for our conversation. But all of the point I'm trying to make is that's supposed to be a temporary measure, isn't it?
Yes, so you would expect inflammation to occur in that scenario, kind of that acute response, but then reduce back down to kind of normal resting levels. Your cytokines should be within a healthy range. What we were particularly interested in is what happens in instructors with those levels. We did some work in our laboratory looking at kind of responses to heat exposure to see if instructors developed a kind of acclimatized state. So were they better at coping in the heat than your average individual? And a kind of nuanced extra thing that we discovered that we weren't really looking for in that study was that their inflammation response to a heat exposure happened in a similar way to the other participants who weren't instructors, but their resting levels were already high before they'd done anything else. So they had higher levels of some of these cytokines, some of which are linked to a higher risk of things like cardiovascular events and diseases. So that kind of sparked the direction of this paper, starting to think about the case, well, that was just a very small group of instructors we saw with these already high resting levels that gave us a little bit of thought for concern and wanting to see whether this was more universally apparent in instructors.
The team here at the podcast are extremely excited to announce our brand new partnership with Patrol Store UK. Patrol Store has been serving the UK's police, fire and emergency communities and first responder sector since 2008, providing leading brands such as Hikes, Magnum, 511, Nebo, OpZulu, Highlander, AKU and many, many more of our favourites. They are now also supplying bespoke uniform, PPE and station workwear to fire services around the UK. So for all our listeners that are part of your USAR, your HEART team, your ISAR team, your armed response teams, your fire investigation, your NALO, your hazmat and all of the training departments that have got your own budgets, be sure to get the absolute best for your team at a realistic price by contacting Aaron and the team at Patrol Store and referencing the Firefighters podcast. Patrol Store will also be taking part in our listener competition giveaways as well as providing unique discounts to podcast listeners. So for people that are always asking about Hikes boots as an example, that is one unique discount code that is coming to you very soon through Patrol Store. We've also got some incredible bags. I mean, the OpZulu bags are a game changer. So you know the really Gucci and expensive tactical black bags that everyone's using in CrossFit workouts and taking to the gym and taking to stations? Well, they've basically got that, but it's made better and costs less. because they're not slapping some Gucci expensive brand name on it and it's giving you what you want on a first responder salary. Be sure to keep your eyes in the notes of the episodes for links to unique offers and discount codes. And if you're looking to buy well and buy once, be sure to get in the notes and head over to Patrol Store UK. Now back to the show. So if you're truly, if you have a better level of conditioning and sort of environmental familiarization, what's the word I'm looking for? Your better acclimatization, your thermoregulation is much better. Like children can't do this, can they? You get febrile seizures and stuff like that where children just can't down-regulate their own temperature. They just seem to get hotter and hotter, and they can have little seizures and stuff. My daughter had it a couple of times, really scary, where they just keep getting hotter and hotter, and you can't cool them off, and then they go into a fit. It's horrible. As adults, we should obviously have the ability to regulate that. But you're saying at resting levels, even though we would think they would have a better conditioning and tolerance to this, they were already sitting at a heightened level. So would that mean that? So they would automatically, you said their reaction to it was the same as everybody else's. What would we class as them being conditioned to it then? What would have been a perfect outcome? Because with this stuff, you can't go in with your own biases. I appreciate that, but like, what were you expecting to see? As much as you shouldn't have your own biases.
So what I meant there in terms of the response being similar, that was from an inflammatory perspective. So what we saw with the instructors was that their core temperature was lower to begin with, and the change in core temperature was less. The heart rate was lower. They had increased sweating responses and increased plasma volume. So they had what we would class as a typical kind of presentation of someone who was heat acclimated. So imagine people who go
higher
out.
Plasma, meaning obviously, just to make it really stupid, more fluid, the body can dissipate that heat easier. They've got a lower resting temperature and heart rate to start with, so they're not going to spike and react, and they can control that flow and dissipation of the heat through the body's natural thermoregulation. But the other elements then, sorry.
Yeah, so the other element in terms of that thermoregulation side of things is that whilst they were able to have this acclimated state, which we would normally think of as being a really good thing, you're able to cope better in the heat. That's what we want. Typically we think about reducing the risk of a heat illness occurring, for instance. So that we think of as a good thing. But what we were a little bit concerned about was these kind of markers that suggested this chronic inflammation when they were just at rest before we'd even done anything to them. And when we looked at the data, this was linking to the number of exposures that these individuals had been experiencing, and made us start thinking, well, is there almost a point of going too far in the number of exposures you're doing regularly? So you're adapting to the heat, and that's good. But are you almost maladapting because you've had so many exposures that you're starting to see some negative consequences, possibly in the form of this inflammation? So that was on a very small group of individuals, kind of a bit of a surprise for us, I guess, in what we were seeing. And so we started to then look at what happens when we get more individuals and we make some comparisons to firefighters, which is where this project really came from.
Were you able to, how much personal information were you able to go into with these individuals in terms of the spread of age, personal habits? Like, whilst we're sitting here talking now, I think I'll probably overhydrate now because I'm so scared of doing it wrong and the things. And I also feel a cognitive sort of impairment if I'm not well hydrated. And in the study you speak about those elevated levels of cytokines stimulating that recuperation and sickness behaviors. Weight loss, depression, fatigue and sleep disturbances. Depression's a very emotive subject. I would probably say for myself, I've experienced bouts of just low mood and numbness when I'm doing too much of this. And I always just associated a lot of that to dehydration and not really being in a very ideal working environment, and sleep is naturally disturbed for first responders anyway. It's hard to get a sterile sample group. So like in the second element of it, I think it says around 136 UK Fire and Rescue Service personnel recruited from the following services. We won't name them, but there's a good spread of the 130. People can go and read this anyway. 136 participants, 44 were BAIs, 43 males, 1 female. Oh, it's a shame we couldn't get more than 1 female, because I know that's some of the work you're going on to look into now, because I do think we react differently, don't we? 92 were operational firefighters, in addition 14 non-heat exposed control participants, 10 males, 4 females, recruited from the University of Brighton. So we've got that sort of double blind element of having someone outside of the sector to try and get a bit of a norm for it as well. So when you went into doing these studies, you say you did a lot of stuff in the lab. What were these individuals being exposed to, and sort of how were you taking the samples? Were you taking blood, sweat, urine,
Yep.
or just all that sort of jazz?
So this specific study that we're talking about here in terms of this paper, we collected samples across a 6-month period. So we visited 3 times. So at the very beginning, then 3 months later, and then 6 months later. And we visited individuals on their stations, at their training centres, travelling around the UK to the various different locations, trying to catch watches at the right time of day before anyone went off to do other things. Sometimes data collection got ruined because we were mid-taking samples and the alarm went off and everyone had to leave and go and do their jobs. So it was a little bit interesting. So yeah, very interesting at various points, and kind of setting up in tiny little offices to take data. But the data collection involved a big range of things. So we were taking blood samples to look at these different markers of inflammation that we were talking about. So blood samples. We're also looking at urine samples to look at contaminant levels, which isn't in this paper. We were looking at kind of some factors we were trying to control for a little bit. So things like we were measuring blood pressure, we were working at BMI, so height and weight was being collected. We were also asking some questionnaires to do with mood and fatigue as well. So some validated kind of questionnaires like the profile of mood states and a fatigue inventory data as well. And we were also trying to gather information about individuals' exposures. So how often were they having exposures? What type? Were they regularly exercising? What type of exercise were they doing? How long had they been in their role for instance? How long had they been employed by the fire service for? So really quite comprehensive to try and really see if we could control for as many things as possible, and kind of get individuals grouped in the right way to enable us to make comparisons where we could.
So during this process, that must have taken, how long did it take? Did it over 6 months?
Yeah, not everybody started at the same time though.
I was going to say, this is a heavy lift, because I think you've listed quite a few services there, and they don't necessarily all geographically complement each other. So there's a lot of travel and challenge. But I suppose if you don't go and take the stuff yourself...
Oh no, I went to all of them.
That's what I mean. It's like gathering evidence, and you're like, I can't really get that one in because you've not really done it right, and you've not controlled for this, that, and the other. That must be an absolute nightmare for you at times. So as you said, the study aimed to investigate the immunological and psychological consequences of BAI and firefighter workloads over a 6-month period. BAI completed a significantly greater number of fire exposures in common comparison to firefighters. Despite this, psychological factors as measured by the POMS and MFI, what are they, sorry?
So POMS is the profile of mood state, so that's kind of the mood-based questionnaire, and MFI is what's called a multi-dimensional fatigue inventory, so it's a questionnaire all about fatigue, essentially. Okay,
so there were not different between personal groups and demonstrated small fluctuations over time. However, HBAI reported the greatest prevalence of ill health symptoms. Blood sample analysis also highlighted that BAI exhibited elevated biomarker levels in comparison to firefighters' CO1 or BAI elevations persisting across 6 months. So what were, and I apologise if I'm asking you to repeat yourself, but just to reiterate and go into I'm trying to make it useful and tactical for people so that if they don't have access to all this type of testing, what were some of the elevated biomarkers? I know I'm asking you to point at things that perhaps you're not supposed to point at as a result of your work, but how would people be able to commonly see if they are struggling from these biomarkers?
So that's a bit tricky in that most doctors would not commonly test for any of these things. They might test for C-reactive protein, CRP, if they were concerned about risk of cardiovascular disease. It's a marker that's kind of really commonly included in the evaluation of that risk. But most of the other ones...
What would be included within cardiovascular disease? Again, just for people, including myself, let's say, what does that really mean? You're saying, what are you saying? Lung cancer? Are you saying difficulty in general breathing, COPD? What do we mean by that?
Yeah, so cardiovascular disease, we're primarily thinking about heart disease, vascular problems, the risk of a heart attack happening primarily. Those are the types of conditions very specific to the kind of the heart functioning. And when we're talking about those, there's numerous risk factors that can be put together into a bit of a calculation to come out of a score about how risky you are at risk of them. And most of those things are things like your age, whether you smoke or not, the type of diet you have, levels of cholesterol, for instance, whether you kind of different factors about body fat percentage, family history, for instance. So a lot of those factors you would probably know for yourself, or fairly easy for a doctor to assess. And CRP, C-reactive protein, is one marker that is also included sometimes in that kind of risk profile, essentially. A lot of these other markers are things that wouldn't commonly be tested for unless perhaps you were kind of quite concerned about your health and unwell and maybe in a hospital type scenario.
Why do you think we don't test for these things generally? So I've got a few friends, believe it or not. So I've got a few friends all over the world, and a few of them in Canada as an example. Every year they go, and part of their annual fitness testing is they have blood and urine tested. I think they don't have an MRI scan. They have something else. They seem to have a much more in-depth testing procedure around any chronic debilitating health conditions. I know in the UK we have started doing some cancer screening, I think it's termed, around some of those biomarkers of firefighters, and I think predominantly that's being done through blood and urine samples. I don't know how often it's been done. I know there's a couple of services that have started trialing it, but given that we're asking people in the first responder community to work until they're 60 at least, probably 65, I feel quite strongly that we're kind of setting ourselves up to fail, in that we know through work such as yourselves, and also just evidence from the sector itself, people retiring at 50, 55, sometimes due to musculoskeletal injuries, sometimes a lot to do with stress. But there is a growing number of people that do have these chronic debilitating cardiovascular, respiratory or cancerous diseases, unfortunately. And we seem to be starting to connect the dots with how much of that is to do with our occupations. Now, I also appreciate there's a certain amount of accountability people need to absorb themselves when their diets and the way that they live their lives. For those that performed well, I suppose let's close the loop on that one, because I did ask you a question within that. Why do you think we're not doing as much of a comprehensive testing as perhaps other nations? And it might be a nice segue into some of the work you did with the WHO and some of the contributions you've perhaps heard from other parts of the world, and how passionately or dispassionately they were giving attention to this.
I guess from my perspective, there's perhaps two reasons.
Okay.
One is that there are an awfully large number of markers that you can measure, and it's still a little bit unclear about which are perhaps the key one that you would then recommend to be tested, how often you would test that, and exactly what the consequences of that marker test would be. So I think there's a little bit of work to be done in this area in terms of exactly what screening should look like. And I think until we perhaps have
So do you not just generically do blood when you take a blood sample and it gives you a panel? Is it more expensive to test more things?
Yes, completely more expensive to test more things, and it will depend on the things you're looking for, to what things you select to test. So in this study, we purposely selected all of the things that we have tested. They're not there by accident.
Okay.
So it's a little bit of a case of what do you pick to test and how frequently do you test it. And if you're going to ask fire services or whoever to pay for this testing to be done, there needs to be evidence and clear evidence for the need for it and the cost effectiveness and the benefits of it. And so the link between those two aspects, I guess at the moment, is slightly missing. Work's being done in that type of direction. But yeah, it's trying to work out exactly what screening should look like in a way that is actually affordable. Well? And I think that is the second element of it, in terms of where does the money come from, and the time and the expertise, and who is responsible for these things, and what happens based on the outcome of these tests.
Yes. sometimes when you're not looking, it's kind of easier to go, well, maybe not. But I also think I think this was I said about my sister before we came on. She's a public servant as a deputy head. Public servants really are, and I don't know if you have this in the education sector. I imagine some of your colleagues may or may not be getting paid more or less than you in the private sector doing other things. But people often go into education, academia, the public services or education, like for my sister as an example, because they have sometimes a little bit of a stronger why behind what they want to do. They kind of join it for the outcome, not for the income. But public servants, I often just feel don't particularly get looked after very well. There always is that look of who's going to pay for this and how long do I need this person for as well, without seeming too much of a pessimist. Ever heard the quote that true leaders are readers? Well, we believe this is true. Listeners often ask where we go to keep our finger on the pulse of what's happening in the sector globally. So there are a few key publications which I encourage you to go check out. Now, if you're looking for insights on disaster management, fire protection and firefighting, for us, we go to Asia Pacific Fire Magazine. And when you're looking for the latest on the Middle East fire protection industry and fire services, it's Gulf Fire Magazine. And our quarterly check-in is with International Firefighter Magazine, reporting to municipal, industrial and fire training professionals. Now, next up, and widely accepted to be the global voice for passive and active fire protection. This is a good one. It's International Fire Protection Magazine. And finally, and perhaps the most relevant to our predominantly UK audience, I'd strongly suggest subscribing to UK Fire Magazine, reporting to the United Kingdom fire protection industry and fire services. We're really excited to announce that after a long-standing relationship and mutual respect, we've now partnered with MDM Publishing, who bring you all of these essential publications. Because in a world of change, the learners shall inherit the earth, while the learned shall find themselves perfectly suited for a world that no longer exists. Eric Hoffer said that, and I believe he was right. So keep growing, keep learning, and keep yourself in the know and at the cutting edge of what's happening globally by dropping into the notes. And as a gift from the podcast, you can actually subscribe to any of these publications for free using the link in our notes. Now back to the show.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. A lot of people, in academia and the types of jobs, the emergency responders, they go in it for the love of the job or the reason why they're doing the job. And I think one of the things we should be doing is looking after individuals in our emergency services. And I think that is absolutely key in that people in the emergency services are incredibly highly skilled and incredibly valuable to the whole population. And so making sure they're looked after to be able to do their job as well as they can, well, that's the whole reason I research in this area primarily, I guess.
I think you're kind of relying on people that are romantic enough or stupid enough to want to do those sorts of jobs. And I say that respectfully as someone that does do one of those sorts of jobs. I'm like, you know what I mean? Most people would do it even if they weren't getting paid. Like, you have a lot of volunteers, paramedics and public servants around the world, certainly a lot of firefighters. They're probably going to do it anyway. That's why we don't need to pay them much more and all this stuff. Anyway, so back to the World Health Organization. Was there any discrepancy between the academic rigor which have been applied in different parts of the world, and when we say the World Health Organization, who's actually involved in something like that? What's the size of the team that you were sort of corresponding with?
So I think there's about 25 experts that had been asked to join, plus the kind of team from the World Health Organization group themselves as well, that help run the writing and the process. Those experts are kind of grouped based on their expertise. So some look at defining the exposure itself. Some are looking at the data in terms of the relationship between the prevalence of cancers that have been seen, and some, which is the group that I fall into, are looking at the mechanistic evidence, which essentially just means the pathways through which the exposure could cause cancer from a little bit more of a kind of a physiology, chemistry underpinning. So a little bit more detail in terms of what's happening to the human body and how might it actually be related to cancer actually happening. So 25 individuals, I think it's 25, split across all of those different topic areas. And that includes people from lots of different countries. So I think there was myself and Professor Steck from the UK. There's individuals from America on there, from Portugal, from lots of different European countries. So a really big range of individuals who all have expertise either in kind of analysis of data related to cancer prevalence, or to do with firefighting in particular, or chemists involved in kind of the chemicals that are involved in those types of exposures. So a big range of experts from lots of different countries.
Anna, Professor Steck, sorry. I feel, and you have absolutely no reason to pass comment on this, I feel she wasn't given a tremendous amount of love and support from the hard work she did supporting with some of the tragedies in the UK, Grenfell being specific. I know some of the unions were very thankful and appreciative of the work that she did, but I think that was one of the first times where someone with an academic background shined an uncomfortable, non-malicious light on some very useful data into what's actually happening to our first responders. And I'm not going to ask you to speak on her behalf. I've had correspondence with her a few times. I hope to have her on at some point. But I just feel like I hope she didn't have too much of a negative experience with that, because I feel as though she wasn't fully appreciated. It's like you've asked, and it's like me taking my car to the garage maybe and going, tell me what's going on, and they go, Pete, you're a terrible driver. You keep punching the brakes all the time. You've really ruined this entire vehicle. And I'm like, oh, thank you very much for your opinion, but I'm going to politely ignore that because you're making me feel bad.
Yeah, I think sometimes when we're talking about health conditions or tragic scenarios, it's difficult conversations, and
it's very emotive, isn't it?
I think it is, and it is tricky sometimes to get the balance and to help people think about it from a perspective that us as researchers are coming from, in that really all we want to do is help, and to help think about the more we know, the more we can do about certain things, and the interventions that can be put in place to improve things for the future, and trying to make sure that's the understanding.
Because you have no political bias on any side of anything. That's the beauty of academia and science and data. It's often, I mean, people can cut data however they choose. I've learned that a lot from marketing and other elements of it. But like you say, when you come at it from an academic perspective, you're just helping people introduce them to the right tools to be able to accurately measure the thing that they're asking you to measure, and then you just give the information back to them and say, well, this is what I found.
Yeah, completely right. And oftentimes when we're running research projects, we make it very clear in terms of, we're not going to provide individual participants' data to their employees. They're not going to get any trouble or anything like that associated with it. We're not, we might, I'm part of the academic group that communicates with NFCC, for instance, and I've got links with the FireFit steering group, but I'm very much there. I'm an independent individual. I'm not being paid by any of these people, and it's the case of,
Isn't that a bit sad though? I feel like you should be. Because otherwise, how are we going to continue to attract talented, knowledgeable individuals such as yourself, Anna, and others to help us solve these very challenging problems? But again, it alludes back to that element of the public sector not having an endless checkbook sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, occasionally different organisations or aspects will fund a project. It's unusual. It's more often that they might say they'd support it, in that they're happy to kind of write a letter to say they're supporting this project happening. And in that case, it's very much always communicated that whatever the findings are what they are. So very much an independent side of things.
Yeah, I just think it's unfortunate. Like, it probably gets pitched as an opportunity, like, as many things do in the public. This is a great opportunity for you, Emily, to be able to contribute to something. You can put it on your CV. And I'm like, yeah, but eventually we should start paying this person for something, because they are putting a colossal amount of time into it. But anyway, so take us back to the World Health Organization. When you were speaking with colleagues from around the world, and again, we won't have to name names or countries even, if perhaps, did you see any correlating trends? Had they done similar research? Had we seen similar things? And I appreciate there's lots of environmental and societal factors that differ, and genetics and things from people in different nations. But at some point, you've got to plant a flag in the sand and say, we're going to measure off this rate because this is the closest comparative data sample. Was there any data that was contributed from other nations? Yeah,
so data came from lots of different countries. Probably one of the leading areas and countries wise is coming from America. That's primarily because of the number of individuals they have to recruit from, but also the funding that's available there. They have much more funding for bigger projects, particularly in the fire and rescue service, in comparison to what other countries have and have access to. And so I think that really enables them to run studies of a much more comprehensive nature than perhaps we might be able to.
I think that's also driven by their litigation world, isn't it?
Yep.
Like, people sue a lot of people over there, so they want to be able to say if you're right or you're not right.
Completely agree.
They tend to put more time into that.
Yeah, I think it also comes down to the private healthcare that they have versus the NHS that we have here, and the way that their healthcare is run, and therefore the need and the money put aside for these kind of things, and the compensation culture a little bit. Yeah.
So were the comparative elements that came out around these like inflammatory markers and that sort of long-term chronic exposure, were we seeing similar correlating evidence around the potential damage or inflammatory markers over a long period of time?
Yeah, so from an inflammation perspective, there's studies from lots of different countries that show that there's acute inflammation, so kind of a one-off exposure causes this inflammation to occur. There is less data from a chronic perspective, and it was much discussed within the kind of monograph process, but there is sufficient data was ended up being concluded on. So in terms of their inflammation side of things, there's lots of countries and lots of evidence out there that shows an acute exposure was causing inflammation. But from a chronic perspective, there's a little bit less data and evidence available. So there was some evidence that was showing kind of markers to do with both airway inflammation and systemic inflammation in some of those markers that I was talking about, and also associations between kind of lung function and inflammatory markers were seen too. So overall, it was a little bit debated, and you can see this written in the Lancet summary report about whether there was what we call consistent and coherent data for chronic inflammation. There was a minority that kind of thought that it was perhaps only suggestive data, but the majority of individuals overall made the conclusion that there was sufficient data here to suggest this consistent and coherent aspect for this chronic inflammation. Now, the paper we're talking about wasn't actually part of this review because it came out after this monograph process had actually happened. Yeah, so the Lancet summary...
Is it publicly available?
Yeah, so
would you be able to send me a link to it?
Yeah, of course, yeah, I can do. So yeah, the paper we're talking about in terms of inflammatory and psychological aspects, that wasn't included in the monograph review because of the timing aspects. But yeah, the monograph is available in the full version. I think it's something like 800 odd plus pages, so it's rather a long read.
Fantastic.
But the summary document... but that's why there's a nice summary document instead, which is about 2 pages long and gives you the key points.
Version for me.
There is a very helpful infographic as well.
Oh, thank God. I hope it's you reading something about it. And it sounds nice. But I also say, like Brian Cox is a great example of it. I say if you know a subject well enough, you should be able to explain it to a 10-year-old. Use 10-year-old language and tell me, what did we find?
It's very true, yeah. Although I think from a World Health Organization perspective, they do need the big, large document as well.
Yes, they did teach you all those big, nice words for a reason. We would like to use some of them, please, Dr. Watkins, if you can. Okay, so let's see. You said there was not undeniable, but unequivocal, where by the nature of the fact, the sheer quantity and the correlations that you saw between them. As a result of that, and just to try and force you into a corner of advice, just for people that are out there and they've heard all this, lots of big words and stuff like this. What advice would you have from people off the back of this? If your partner, husband, wife, son, daughter, cousin, nephew, niece was in this job, what would you be recommending? If you're a regular listener to the podcast, then chances are you are big into your own personal development and the development of firefighters around you. So I wanted to remind you of our mobile app Drillbook. This is a free training and development resources made by firefighters for firefighters. Heading on to Drillbook, you will find incident debriefs, radio messages, knots and lines, quick reference guides, quizzes every single day. We've got useful links to the ERG, to Web Rescue, to Jessup, Euro Rescue, 10-second triage, National Operational Guidance, and not to mention our daily quizzes where you will find questions on extrication, casualty handling, breathing apparatus, fire development, water rescue, rope rescue, you name it. It is the go-to resource if you've got a spare 5 minutes on the firehouse to develop yourself and those around you. Not only that, if you're looking to get into the fire service, we've got advice on there on interview questions, interview answers. You can build your own questioning in there. And again, remember, this is built by firefighters for firefighters, so you can add your own drills in there. You can pick the drills that you find the most favorite. There is literally hundreds of training ideas, hundreds of drills in there. Remember, this app is absolutely free and it grows every single day down to the contributions of our thousands and thousands of users. It's freely available on Android, Apple, and you will find it in the links for this podcast. Remember, it's called personal development. The clue's in the name. You've got to work twice as hard on yourself as you do on the job. So always be growing, always be developing. Now let's get back to the show.
I guess I would be thinking about a handful of things. One would be keeping track of how many exposures you're doing, particularly for instructors that might have quite high numbers. But thinking, with climate change and recent levels of wildfires in the last few years, starting to think about that might carry on with the severity and the frequency of heat waves and the likelihood of more fires in the future. So keeping a log of the number of exposures you're having, starting to get to know what's normal for you from a health perspective, so that you can pick up changes in mood or changes in fatigue, and also kind of symptoms related to cancer, starting to get to know what those are as well. So knowing your own body and knowing what's normal for you and keeping a log of these things. Thinking about getting early support when you need it. So if you are starting to suffer some of these symptoms that we've been kind of talking about a little bit today, in terms of particularly instructors, seeking kind of help and support when that happens. And also doing, I guess, everything you can to reduce your type of exposure you're experiencing. So being hydrated before a one-off exposure can help reduce your heart rate and your core temperature responses, for instance. So hydration is an easy thing that most people should be able to do. Thinking about whether you're cooling down
Is that
properly.
just general hydration, or are we talking electrolytes? And again, I know this is not an area of your study, but would you just advise because obviously post-wear we advise electrolytes and all sorts of jazz. But is it just, and what would you class, actually, a lot of the stuff is publicly available to people in terms of what good hydration looks like. But I think most of us, if I had to stick my finger in the air and say the general public, I bet 70-80% of them are just chronically dehydrated.
Yeah, a lot of individuals are. And we often turn up on stations and collect urine samples and see that dehydration is apparent. Although in a recent study we were collecting some data for, it was really lovely to see all the urine samples looking nice, lovely colours, and everyone starting their day being hydrated. Not many people probably say that's lovely, but it was for me.
Yeah, no. Then again, people aren't, our overlords aren't bad people. Like, they're little things. It's those. This is like the next level of study. Like, how do you impact that as well, isn't it? And those kind of environmental, sort of socio-dynamic studies around how do we encourage that behavioural change for it. So services have issued everybody with like water bottles and making sure there's at least 2 or 3 water dispensers on each level of a floor. Things like this, which really are predominantly low-hanging fruit, but the upsides on so many of them, it's probably hard. I always say, like, the things that are, not everything that gets measured matters, and often the things that matter most don't always get measured. But like, if you are just better hydrated, I can certainly feel the difference. I don't mind if I wee every hour, to be honest. I think that's a big of a problem for my women. Like, my wife's had 3 children, and she, I think, actively doesn't hydrate enough because she doesn't want to wee all the time.
Yeah, particularly if you're a firefighter.
For women to find, especially if my wife's not a firefighter, but even for her, she says, I don't like weeing all the time, and I don't want to get caught out, and blah blah blah. She goes out caring for animals and all this sort of stuff. But I just say to her, look, you're not measuring the cost of that brain fog, your inability, your cognitive ability, your skin, your hair, everything. To be honest with you, like, I always say, water falls from the sky for free, yet we'll wake up in the morning, pour 1.5 litres of it through a coffee machine, we'll stand underneath a hot version of it for 30 minutes or whatever. We never think to just have a pint of water in the morning. But also, some people, they say they don't like the taste and this, that and the other, and I just think, Jesus Christ, this stuff's free and you can't make people do it. If you sold it in a pill, I'm sure people would have it. But it's like, Jesus, the hardest things.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think, combining a little bit of carbohydrate and some electrolytes in there, if that helps, particularly after an exposure, that's beneficial in helping from a hydration perspective as well. I guess the other aspects in terms of what advice and what we can do alongside those kind of little things from an acute exposure perspective is also thinking about looking after yourself as well. So being in a good perspective from a fitness side of things, a healthy weight, those aspects can help reduce the risk of numerous different health conditions and help you cope better with exposures as well. So being responsible for your own body too, thinking about your diet, for instance, maintaining a healthy lifestyle essentially.
These things start to feel like personal attacks, is the problem. They do though, don't they? Do you know what I mean? I think that's what's so hard for some of these organisations. It's the whole, you can lead a horse to water, you can't make him drink, quite literally in this analogy. But like you say, with fitness levels and personal dietary elements and stuff like that, you can't do it for them. Do you know what I mean? People really have got to take, I think it's easy, and that may have been like your thought perhaps going into this conversation, it's easy for people to point at the government or my employer and say, you're not doing enough for me. You're not doing enough for yourself. Come on. You're a grown adult. You know all this stuff. You were probably taught it as a child. You're not doing the fundamentals. And then you're arguing with me to completely remap a multi-million-pound fire station to reduce your exposure to heat or carcinogens, but you're not doing a lot of the fundamental levers that are within your sphere of control and influence that would probably help you the most.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of the two. It's the self-responsibility for the things that you have control over, and it's the side of things in terms of the decontamination perspective. So some of that is self-responsibility about when you're removing kit and when you're cleaning kit and when you're showering, for instance. But some of it is also down to what equipment and facilities are available to you. Do you have designated clean zones within your facilities?
Yeah.
Do you actually have showers available to you? Do you have enough spare
I've been
kit
to
to
some fire
change
stations
kit?
in Scotland that still haven't got running water.
That can't be true.
I've seen it is crazy. Like someone said a great quote to me the other day. It was like, the future is already here, but it's not evenly distributed. And I thought, what a fantastic quote that is, because you're right. Like even in the UK, you and I probably have a certain level of socioeconomic value and live a certain type of life, but that's not the same for everybody. Even just here in the UK, let alone the tragic circumstances some people are living in different worlds. But yeah, I think here in the UK, some of our problems are champagne problems. Like we should be able to solve some of these fundamentals, like giving people access to showers in the hour, decontamination, and to focus back in on our conversation. A lot of this isn't massively, and again, the decontamination thing, I know it's not necessarily an area of your own personal expertise or study, but a lot of that again is behavioural. We can give you a lot of the stuff, but you're the ones that have got to enact it.
Yeah, and it is a combination of, do you have access to what you need to be able to do what you need to do? And then are you actually doing it? And it's the combination of both of those things that are going to help people to essentially look after themselves for their own career and maximising their time in their job, but also thinking about a long and healthy retirement as well. You want to be able to finish your job at a time that you want, at the age that you choose, and be able to enjoy your retirement. And so looking after your health now and thinking about it now is going to do the most that you possibly can to enable you to have that future that you want.
Yeah, I always think, what would me tomorrow want me today to do? That's what you've really, what are those mailbox money advantages that I can pay now, like in time, resources, focus, self-accountability, that the me of 5 years, 10 years, or even tomorrow is going to thank me for? Do you know what I mean? Otherwise, I'm just borrowing time from tomorrow, which I'm never going to pay back because I'm not doing these foundational elements.
Yeah, completely agree with you.
So in terms of, because I want to be respectful of your time, I know we're approaching our hard stop. You said you do work with NFCC, FireFit, all of these elements. Cast our minds either forward, because I know a lot of your work now is taken up by your students as well, and helping that next generation of great thinkers to come through and support more work like this. But what are you looking at on your horizon moving forward? You mentioned a really interesting piece that kind of perked my interest. Nikki Woods was the lady that reminded me. A lady called Nikki Woods got in contact with me around a book called The Man's Guide to Menopause, because there is a growing interest of how we're creating environments that are, because we talk about diversity and inclusivity and all this sort of stuff. Sometimes I think we just write it on the wall and we don't fully embrace that. We just think like we need to virtue signal in the right directions. I think we have the right motivations, but I don't think when the rubber meets the road. And you mentioned you're doing some sort of, or hoping to do some sort of study into the area of female firefighters.
Yeah, so when we were conducting kind of the data collection for some of the papers we've talked about today, I was often coming across female firefighters on stations, and they were asking me questions and I just didn't have the answers to them. And so I went away and I tried to find the answers, and I still couldn't find them. And really, with the growing number of women being recruited to the fire and rescue service, we need to start, in my opinion, doing a little bit more to understand the unique nature in terms of the physiological differences that the women have to men. And this isn't just unique to fire and rescue services. You look at data from medical research, nearly all of it is based on males. So it's not just a fire service issue. But I think given the kind of recruitment increases that we're seeing, we need to start thinking about what can we do to help support women in these roles, and what health issues might be coming up in the future that we perhaps need to be considering, and having kind of thinking proactively about what can we do. And so some of that is thinking about the menopause and getting a better understanding of thermoregulation, and about what kind of support we should be offering perhaps in the future. Starting to think a little bit about aspects to do with fertility and maternity support as well. So a whole range of issues, all associated with female firefighters, really stemming from what women think is important for them and what concerns they have.
Because I think as much as we like to think we're all the same, we should be the same in terms of opportunity and creating environments where we can all learn and grow and reach our own potential and all that sort of jazz. But there are elements as our bodies go through them as natural cycles of life that we do, there is very obvious forks in the road where we start to change as we age. And I think we should create environments that can facilitate that. So far as, like you say, should we be having female BAI instructors past the age of 50 or whatever it might be? You know, some women can go through menopause as early as 30, I know, sometimes even younger. But knowing what we could do to better support that individual to continue to contribute to the job that they love for a longer period of time, because they are all firefighters. And again, this won't differentiate from police and other elements as well, where their challenges will be unique to those sectors. But you also made a great point, like a lot of the stuff we've done in the past, the last 80 years, from that whole Johari's window, the unknown unknowns, you don't realise that you have designed all of these environments, all of these uniforms, all of these things. They've been designed with men in mind, not because malice and we just think we're more important than everybody else. That was just the sample size of what was available then, because they were the people, you know, this is before the times of, you know, women's independence and creating more inclusive workspaces where people of different sexes, of whatever they self-identify as, can access these things. And now we kind of do need to go and rethink all of these things because we've unconsciously set them up with a different framework in mind, haven't we?
Yeah, completely. And it might be in some cases the physiological differences between men and women don't make a difference in some scenarios, and it is not an issue. But there might be that in some situations there are, and that other support is needed. And it's not because this kind of thing is new or it's different. It's more because we already have the data on men, but we don't have the data on women. And so once we have that information, we can be much more informed about the policies, the practices, and the support that's available. And just like you say, you know, you're going to train people to be highly skilled in their jobs, and you want them to be able to be in their jobs, male or woman, for as long as they possibly want to be.
Have you, who have you been managing to speak with and engage with in the hopes of, because I know you've got a million and one things going on, so this perhaps is not at the top of your, even if you're really enthusiastic and passionate to start it right now, this is something that's got to fit in and around the rest of the work that you do. But who are you looking to work with this sort of stuff? Have you spoke with women in the fire service?
Yeah, so we've had some conversations going with women in the fire service about a few issues and kind of research possible directions. We're also talking about...
They sent you a long list of everything they'd love for you to look at, and you're like, wow, each one of these is like an 8-month thing, so... Maybe send me back your top 2.
Yeah, I think we've been talking with different colleagues in different areas and lots of talks coming out of kind of the menopause conference that I attended, that NFCC ran for the first time last year, for instance. So some really good conversations going on. You know, it's a little bit of a Pandora's box of there's so many different directions and lots of different questions. And hopefully we can start making some roads in some of those moving forward soon.
Beautiful. Emily, thank you so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it. We will put some links in below this. Would LinkedIn be the most appropriate place for people if they wanted to, or would you prefer an email address? If people want some more information about some of the things we've discussed today, or they'd like to participate in something, or they simply want to find out some more information. So we'll have the 2 links to the 2 studies that were referenced, one of which I haven't got access to, but you'll send me that one. I'll have those 2 links. And then would it be preference to LinkedIn or an email address? What would be most appropriate?
Yeah, probably my email address. More than happy to do that. We've actually got a survey that's running live at the moment that looks at a range of different health conditions across firefighters to try and get a bit more of a kind of universal whole person perspective of different types of conditions. And there's also some aspects to do with fertility and menopause that are a little bit more female specific in there. So I can always provide the link for that as well. And if people are happy to get involved, and it's for all individuals in the fire and rescue service, not just operational staff as well. So that'd be great if anyone's keen.
Beautiful. So guys and girls, you've had an hour and a half or so of free stuff. If you're still listening now, that means you've found some form of value in it. And if you have a good moral bone in your body, please do that a little bit back. So go underneath here and we'll say contribute to the study here. It will say in capital letters in bold. Please click on that and it will take you through to the link that Emily's just referred to. And then you can try and help us grow with a greater level and breadth of data and information to try and get some of these answers. Emily, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to speaking with you soon.
Thanks very much.
The Firefighters Podcast was created to recognize, acknowledge, inspire, and hopefully even motivate these incredible individuals who have chosen to be part of the first responder community. Our driving purpose is to create a legacy resource for the current and future generations of firefighters and first responders. We get some incredible feedback from listeners and guests, and as the podcast grows, our desire to create longevity and sustainability means that we are asking for the support of our listeners. If you want to support the podcast, if you want to get discounts to our merchandise, hoodies, clothing, coins, patches, tallies, and also access to all of the incredible documents get shared with us from our podcast guests and sector leaders, then please head over to our Patreon page, and for just £3 a month, you can support the future of the podcast. Please finally hit that follow, subscribe, or rate button on the platform you're listening, and wherever you are in the world, please support your emergency services responders, and thank you for listening.